Our first speaker is Joe Parslow, who's a researcher, lecturer, and occasional producer whose work explores drag performance and queer communities. Please welcome onto the stage Joe Parslow.
Cool. I'm going to lift this up slightly because I'm going to have to try and read. Perfect. That is a mic technique garnered from spending time setting up stages for drag queens and then realizing they're a lot taller than you think they are. So today I want to talk to you about how I found hope and survival and politics in drag. In not just any drag, but drag performance, which on the face of it seems absolutely silly. This silly performance work is important to me, or at least feels important, because it's happening at a time of increasing levels of homophobia and transphobia in the UK and beyond. So in 2016, Cheryl Hole, now a contestant on the first season of RuPaul's Drag Race UK, sang I Am What I Am as part of a local drag competition she was taking part in. Cheryl sang with passion and pleasure, and in watching at the time, I was struck by how intensely political it felt. I've repeatedly questioned why this act felt political. What was so political about a drag queen from Essex singing a song done by so many drag queens that it's almost become a parody of drag performance? Despite this, the sense of politics and its importance remained. These ideas of finding politics and hope in seemingly silly drag work started here, trying to understand how the politics of drag performance might emerge in unexpected places. In doing so, I turned to thinking from Sarah Ahmed, who suggests that, and I'm quoting, silliness and all forms of happiness that are deemed superficial can be instructive in coming to value that which is not valued and finding joy in places that are not deemed worthy. We learn about the cost of value and worth. So if silliness was an opportunity to find value and worth in alternative and other places, then this idea of silliness and what I think of as a queer silliness is one way to understand how I might be experiencing hope and politics in Cheryl's work. I then turned to Halberstam's writing around failure, in which they resist being taken seriously, because being taken seriously means missing out on the chance to be frivolous, promiscuous, and irrelevant. The desire to be taken seriously is precisely what compels people to follow the tried and true paths of knowledge production, around which I want to map a few detours. Indeed, terms like serious and rigorous tend to be code words in academia, as well as other contexts, for disciplinary correctness. They signal a form of training and learning that confirms what is already known according to approved methods of knowing, but they do not allow for visionary insights or flights of fancy. So I'm interested in what happens when we do not take ourselves, our theories, or our politics too seriously. What I think of as this queer silliness finds detours on a normative map, a map that inevitably involves violence, and as such locates strategies and modes for resistance. Silliness is a method that does not ignore violence or ignore the threat of violence, but rather it sees violence, accounts for it, takes note of it, and continues dancing despite it. Silliness is a strategy of resistance and one which allows movement in and through violence, refusing to ignore it, but refusing to let it stop the party. So at another time, I saw Fabulous, who's on the screen behind me, a well-known cabaret and drag performer who's known for their celebrity impersonations. They do everyone from Judy Garland and Liza Minnelli to Jackie Kennedy and Princess Diana to Anne Widdecombe and Theresa May. As Liza Minnelli singing Life is a Cabaret, I was struck by similar feelings of hope and politics. In this act, she roams about the audience and at one point is carried around by an audience member who's clad head to toe in skin-tight rubber. At least I think that's how I remember it. And I'm struck by the excessiveness in the work. Just as fabulous as Liza, singing Life is a Cabaret tells us of her friend Elsie, who, after a life of booze and liquor, dies as the happiest corpse she's ever seen. Fabulous teaches us that queer subjects often have to be reminded of the pleasures that lie outside of their bedrooms, as well as the dangers. At another time, I saw her, drag performer, accomplished lip syncer, lip-syncing Avril Lavigne's 2002 song Complicated, interspersed with clips of Carol Vorderman reacting to a contestant completing a very convoluted and complicated sum on the television show Countdown. It was a technically complex act which showcased her exceptional lip sync skills. But what I was struck by throughout was how the work was somehow this nostalgic late 90s reference to Countdown. It was imbued the figure of Carol Vorderman with hope and joy and love and excitement. Her is purposefully silly, and in doing so she invests unexpected sights with love and hope and survival. Here again, I was surprised by where I felt politics and by where I felt hope. I didn't expect to find it in Countdown, and I certainly didn't expect to find it in Carol Vorderman. Lastly, I turn to Victoria Sin. Now, Victoria Sin is a successful and well-known performance and live artist whose practice in art settings often explores contemporary ideas of identity and politics, including their positionality as a femme-identifying person of colour. Whilst this live art practice is fascinating, I'm interested today in the work that Victoria does in club and pub-based drag settings. In one act in particular, they make a sandwich on stage whilst a jaunty song plays in the background. That's the whole act. They make a sandwich on stage and they look out disdainfully at the audience. This is an example for me of queer silliness. It refuses to be political in any way we might expect. It does not represent anything. It is nothing more than the acts that are happening on stage. It does not leave the stage. It does not get better or worse or more than this. It is this moment, their moment, my moment, and nothing else. It doesn't refer to anything. It's not making a point. It does not have a message or a political stance. It's not trying to tell you something or tell you to do something. It's not representational, and it's not historic or futuristic. It's barely even present. It's not telling you why or asking you to ask why. It's not allegorical. It's not a fable, and it's not a story to frighten kids. It's not. This is not a drill. This is not a metaphor. So in trying to work through these initial feelings of hope and survival that I felt when watching drag, I turned to silliness as an academic, performance-based, and political mode. I've invested drag performance work here, invested in it, imbuing these silly performances with hope. I've been purposefully silly about purposefully silly work. I argue that silliness is a strategy that emerges through drag that teaches us to practice different modes of survival in an increasingly phobic straight present. I argue that silliness is a political strategy of refusing this present, when silliness, which is often regulated as non-political, needs to be reinvested as an embodied tactic to locate alternative modes of staying alive. Returning to the idea of silliness and hope, I note how this engagement with silliness also makes queer silliness possible, or that queer silliness means entertaining queer silliness as a possibility despite violence. Sarah Ahmed makes the profound but simple observation that possibilities have to be recognized as possibilities have to be recognized as possibilities to become possible. Doing queer silliness makes queer silliness possible, or recognizes it as a possibility. I propose that queer silliness involves an engagement with this, since it renders possible the idea that there's a beyond homophobia and transphobia, a queer future in which silliness is a strategy that is not a political choice to avoid a threat. Queer silliness offers purposeful strategies to playfully engage with the present, insisting on frivolity, mundanity, and fun, despite and even because of violence. It demands the concrete possibility of a hopeful future in which Liza Minnelli can teach us how to live in the present, Carol Vorderman can help us imagine queer liberation, and making a sandwich on stage could just be making a sandwich on stage. Thank you.